Understory, and joining me in the war room down under today is Nick. Nick, what a crazy week this has been.
Insane, yeah. The first time ever today I paid more than $2 a litre for fuel. So that's, I've been looking into that, looking into why on earth are the fuel prices so high. We could do a whole segment on that one time.
The next thing we're going to look at is censorship and media, and the rise of independent media, in fact. And the reason we're seeing that, Nick, is because people have lost trust in media as well. It's not just government, it's media. And we've got a changing landscape, an incredible changing, not just in Australia, but globally. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, this whole idea of what information I can receive from the government is also what information I might expect and what level of truth from the media.
Well, I think one thing that we saw very strongly, and it was already there, but very strongly during the pandemic, was kind of this unholy alliance between media and government, where the media's job really ought to include holding the government to account, which means questioning, probing, and instead there were some things where the media's approach was instead to say, no, our job is to prevent misinformation, which means to prevent non-government information, which means to toe the line. And we saw that throughout the Western world. We definitely saw it in Australia. The media's approach to its job seems to have shifted. And in the mainstream media, you don't get a plethora of angles on things, you don't get a plethora of ideas. I see this as part of a larger issue that it's not just government. In fact, government at least has some diversity of different, people involved. But we've got what they call, the march of the left through the institutions, the universities and secondary education, the media, the entertainment industry, big tech, all of them really working in lockstep to represent only one specific view of the world.
And I think in the last 12, 15, 18 months in particular, Australians and people in other countries have really started to understand that. And if we were asleep to it before, that's the complacency, but we're no longer complacent. And I was talking to someone the other day and I said, a strength extended becomes a weakness. A strength extended becomes a weakness. And one of our national characteristics, one of our strengths, as we saw it, I think, was the she'll be right, don't worry, mate, it's all okay. That was a strength. We didn't get ruffled and whatever.
It's good to trust, and it's good to not freak out about stuff.
But it bred a complacency, and we allowed things on our watch to occur, and we didn't perhaps expect things like this to. Now we see it. Now we see it for what it is. It's laid bare. It's naked. And it's really distressing, and that's why the rise of independent media, like Regen and other places, is happening, because people are saying, well, what can I believe in? So
I think, and it is part of a big thing. One aspect of it is also just the increasing size of the political divide. The left is becoming more left, the right, some of them at least, are becoming more right, if you like. And I think you can see that in the terminology. Both sides of politics have a word for waking up to things. On the right, people are getting red-pilled. On the left, they're becoming woke. And both of those things represent a realization that they don't actually believe the things that they've been given their whole life. And so people are looking out for truth, and people are finding their own echo chamber, their own source of information that reflects back at them the things that they want to hear. And it's becoming a social problem.
It's a huge social problem, because one of the things that's happened in the last 2 years is the destruction of trust in government. We've talked about church, media, which is what we're talking about now, employers. I mean, you used to have a relationship with your employer. Now you find out, talking to a number of people who 10 years walked out the door because it was just a betrayal, really. And so people are desperate for. I think they're desperate for truth. And so they're looking for it, or we have, Telegram and Signal and these social media tools exploding. I mean, just exploding. And now we've got Truth Social in the US. People want to know that they can rely on somebody telling them a reasonable story, and they know they can't rely on CNN.
And that situation, that search for truth and that, spirit of mistrust, it does create a vulnerability. I think it creates a potential for being misled, for misinformation to take people down the garden path. And I find it very harmful, the fact that a lot of the social media platforms, their algorithms, particularly YouTube, when you search for things one time, it starts to then give you things that match what you've already searched for. And so you get stuck in this cycle where you always see and hear what you want. But the big but is, what is the response? So yes, there is a lot of misinformation. Yes, there is a lot of risk of people being essentially misled. The response to that from government, big tech institutions has been to say, well, no. We are the correct echo chamber. So you have to be in our echo chamber. You can't be in any of the others. We're going to shut them down. And really discovering their power to control the narrative.
Well, that's certainly what Jacinda Ardern did in New Zealand, the Ministry of Truth, effectively. And now the Australian government has allocated over $61 million to shaping, controlling, monitoring, pick a word, what is going to be put into the public domain. And the really concerning thing about that is, if you're elected to Parliament, if you're not conforming to that viewpoint, it's thought police stuff. If you're not conforming, then potentially you could run afoul of those controls. So this is really concerning, because I think it's over 4 million that's being allocated to misinformation. Well, what's the misinformation? Well, who determines the misinformation?
It's worse than that. It's the overall allocation of $60+ million. I can't remember the exact number.
61.4. I think.
61.4. Okay.
Yeah. Can I phone a friend?
Okay. Well, if we discover we're wrong, then we'll correct it at a later date. But the overall allocation is about potential radicalisation and terrorism and things like that.
But it's a drift. It's an easy drift.
The media, of course, immediately jumped on the extreme right wing. They're concerned about right wing terrorists and activists, because we see so much of that. And I guess we do want, if there's going to be a new Christchurch terrorist or someone like that, you do want to pick them up before it happens. But that $60+ million, is it going to achieve that, and how are they spending it? And that's where that $4+ million is about contrary narratives. It's about the government actually providing counter propaganda, if you like. It was essentially a propaganda budget, because they're trying to provide narratives that counter ones that they have appointed as being misinformation, and that's just a really dangerous power for any government to choose to use.
And they're in alliance, is the best word I can think of, with big tech. I mean, they've had conversations with Google, Facebook, and so forth. So there's a real ability for government, in association, alliance with those groups, to control, shape, whether it's shadow banning through the big tech and so forth. I mean, everybody knows that's happening, and that's why we're seeing it's one of the reasons we're seeing the rise of independent media in this country. If you're looking for a conservative, centre-right viewpoint, which media outlets, channels, not just on screen but in print as well, would you go to, for that sort of commentary? It's a really diminishing field in the mainstream, but in the independents, it's not. We now have close to 10 obvious independent sources, and they're really been emerging, and it's people like Maria Z, Monica from Reignite Democracy, Topher also in Melbourne. We've got Cauldron Pool. There's quite a few. Pat Mercedes been doing stuff, and all of those people, by the way, just as a curiosity, are people of faith. So they're stepping forward, and ourselves, we're stepping forward, because the Judeo-Christian ethic, the Judeo-Christian value, is being trashed, and it needs to be regenerated in this country. Hence regen. But these other groups, Matt from Discernal's been doing a great job. So it's really interesting to see. And John Anderson, of course, won't forget him. I mean, a more conservative voice, but long-form interviews with people like Jordan Peterson and so on. These people are actually getting in and actually talking about the things the main media will not. And if they do talk about it, they cleverly misrepresented. And speaking of that, I noticed just this week, the New York Times has suddenly discovered Hunter Biden's lost laptop. The laptop from hell, someone wrote a book.
That's right. I think that's useful to highlight it, because this is an international problem and it has an Australian realisation. So it's biggest in the US, where a lot of these big tech companies.
But they shut that down before the election. They would
not. That is absolutely right. So it's a thread that we can trace back to pre-Donald Trump, but definitely at his election when really ramped up. One of the initial ones that really stands out to me was Alex Jones, right? When Alex Jones was essentially wiped off all of the platforms in one broad sweep because he was classed as misinformation. The most recent was the attack on Spotify's favourite, Joe Rogan. They gave him $100 million deal, so he's kind of too big to fail in a real sense, that he brings in a lot of audience and a lot of cash, and they will follow him. But there is an attempt to actually control the narrative, and they're working in lockstep. I think the Australian realisation of it, this really frustrated me, was that when the government decided to confront an issue with social media platforms, did it confront this issue of cancellation? Did it say, well, social media has been taking privileges of a platform but behaving like a publisher in terms of controlling what's out there rather than just being a common square? But that's not the issue that our government decided to take on. Instead, they took on, are the big media outlets getting their money?
Yes.
Are all of your mainstream media outlets getting the money they deserve for the journalism that they do? Now, that's not necessarily an invalid issue, but of all the things that they could have picked to really stamp down on, they instead protected establishment media rather than protecting.
They gave them a tax holiday as well. So there was some thinking behind that. This is really going to be where we live in the next 6, 12, 24 months, I think, because unless we can get this messaging through, so the reason we're doing this program is to get the things out that people need to understand to make informed decisions. I'm talking about informed consent in the injections. How could you possibly have informed consent when they stifle, shut down and suffocate the argument, the information, to make an informed decision through the medical fraternity, through the media? I mean, it was incredible. So, and even ivermectin. You talk about ivermectin, and you're taken out in the courtyard at sunrise and shot. And yet India used it. But the point I wanted to pick up on the Biden thing was, when that story broke when the election was on, they had nothing to do with it. It was Russian disinformation. It was a whole thing. Now they're saying, oh, there it is. Well, it was always there. So the people who were charged with misinformation, being domestic terrorists or whatever they were saying, are now proven right.
Yeah, it was the New York Post. It was reporting from the New York Post.
So the New York Times would have nothing to do with it.
Hunter Biden's laptop and the evidence that it provided of Hunter Biden's personal activities over a number of years. And they ranged from the sort of personal immoral behaviour to just really irresponsible behaviour through to corruption. And
with the Ukraine
and China.
And now here's the Ukraine. So suddenly we're talking about it. I mean, it's like, but the people who take a position...
But it could have changed the election outcome.
Oh, absolutely.
It could have. And that story came out. It was a valid story. It was good journalism. Came out a month before the election. And all of the social media platforms decided to essentially just ban it so that people wouldn't see it.
Well, I remember seeing some data which said that 18% of Democrat voters, 18%, said after the election they would not have voted for Biden had they known about that story.
Yeah, right? And of course you can't know whether that's true or not, but the election was close, right, in all the key areas, and so it could have changed the outcome.
So, I mean, there's a reason for burying a story, because you think it goes back to the judicial review. I mean, why has that been deferred? It's the same. I mean, there's a logic there. That's why things happen. There's a logic. There's a reason, a rationale. But to call people, domestic terrorists, or to put them on the outside of society because they have a different view, and then to find out later on that the view was actually correct, for example, with the injections or in ivermectin or whatever. I mean, it's wrong. But there's no apology and there's no change. And so the independent media is starting to push back on that. So we celebrate all of those guys. There's about 10, and I mentioned 6 or 7 of them today, but they're all doing great work. And Dave Pello, for example, in Queensland, And they're actually starting to really bring the story through. So I think that's what...
That's right.
And when we've talked to people, they've said, look, this is fantastic what you're doing, because where do we go for truth? They want truth. And
I think there's definitely a space for more conservative media. It's providing access to a worldview that you may not get, well, that you certainly won't get if you're watching ABC, for instance, but that you may not get from any other media outlets. It's presenting facts with that worldview in mind. I think that we want to be fair with the facts. We want to dive deep into the issues. We want to point out underlying aspects of our culture and our system in Australia that are illuminated by the news and the things that are going on. And so really to help people to have access to different perspectives that they're not necessarily going to see anywhere else.
And be prepared to look at, take in, consider alternative viewpoints, and not to be in your own echo chamber, as you said, because you need a balanced view. You know, that I always tell people that, you know, if you look at a tropical fish in a glass bowl, it might look yellow and blue as the light hits it, but if you walk around the bowl, you know, the colour might change.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. Same fish, slightly different colours. So are you prepared to look at the issue from different angles, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. And what the media often does, so our mainstream media has a couple of different reasons and a couple of different ways that they can provide misinformation, essentially, of their own. One of the reasons is just to sensationalise. They want things to be sensational. But another is really to consolidate the worldview that they are supportive of. An example of that, several years back, there were some riots in Melbourne, right?
Yep.
And they announced this on the ABC. There were riots in Melbourne. I'm watching the news report and said, something's not right here. They said there's 200 people running through the streets with knives. No video footage. There's got to have been. This is the modern era. Someone's caught it. So I looked it up online, and sure enough, there was plenty of video footage, but you couldn't watch the video footage without realising that all of the people who were rioting all had the same skin colour. It was a race riot, and the ABC didn't want to trust us with that information. So they didn't say it, and they didn't show the footage. They were shading it from one position. And so their approach to the fishbowl is to grab you by the shoulders, walk you around it, and make sure you're looking at it from a certain angle. And we don't want to do that. To engender trust, we want to say, look, there's multiple angles. There's different things to be seen here. There's different perspectives.
So we'll be trying to do that on Understory and in the war room, getting into the stuff that really matters to this country. You know, looking at the facts, dealing with the facts as we understand them, trying to understand the rationale, the logic, the stratagem that's behind those facts, and then explore the themes that we can appreciate by having a better understanding of what's going on, not accepting some sort of little glib, 30-second doorstop from a politician without any challenge, and understanding that information these days is global. That there really is an avalanche of information, and if you talk to your neighbours and ask them what's their position on topic X or Y, you can pretty quickly determine what they're listening to and watching. You can.
There's definitely a flavour to it, and so the government doesn't need to spend $4 million in misinformation. We've got it covered, guys.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time.